This is Shannon, and this is part 3 of our 3-part series on Ted Bundy. Kathy will be taking us through 3 sections today of the Ted Bundy story, the last 3 sections we've got in this series. The first of which is the details and insights into Ted Bundy's trial, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to be talking about, obviously he had a couple different hearings along the way, but we're mostly going to talk about the final one, which followed the Chi Omega homicides.
Okay, great.
So yeah, we'll start there. And then I also did a little bit of research on 2 of the main people who interviewed him while he was in prison. One who was his main guy when he was on death row. And I'm also going to take us a little bit back just to go over one of the interviews from a journalist who interviewed him before he was caught for the Chi Omega murders. And the reason why I'm going to do that is I want the audience to see how much he changed from pre-death row to death row,
Right.
and how much less he really had to protect himself once there was, nothing quite left and he started giving more information. And then we'll talk about heading towards the day of his execution, and even till the very last day, the stuff he was trying to pull. So
perfect. Yeah. So that lays out the 3 parts we're going to do tonight. We'll start with the trial, right?
We left off on the last episode when he was arrested, and he was arrested for the murder of Kimberly Leach, who was a 12-year-old girl who had been abducted by him following the Chi Omega murders, which were at the sorority. And so once he was arrested in June 1979, Bundy stood trial. So from the beginning, this is where you start to see the psychopathy and the narcissism. If you haven't already, he really starts to now become very overt in this by the way he decides to sort of, quote unquote, handle his own trial. From the very beginning, he completely sabotages his entire case, which is so typical because everything is about control and not thinking about consequence. He needed to be in charge. He needed to represent himself. He was completely paranoid and did not trust. He had 5 different court-appointed attorneys, and he turned them all down. And when he was interviewed about this later, the woman asked him, "Why did you choose to do this?" And he's just simply said, "Well, I just wanted to be involved in my own case." But really,
control.
He needed to be in control, and nobody was going to be as smart as him. And like we've talked about with narcissism before, there's a level of paranoia because they assume people are all like them. So I think that he didn't trust anybody to handle his case.
Well, and there was a ramp up too, right? Because I remember where we left off in the last episode was the end of the killing spree that he had gone on. Mm-hmm. I remember that there was, he was frenzied. He'd gotten out of control. He wasn't really able to hide things or hold back and any of that. So by the time he gets to trial, he's already in this state.
It's almost like a mania in a way, which, and they do sort of go through the mania or the depression as well. And I think that in this state, he was all about, he was on a roll. Like you said, he was on a roll.
For lack of a better,
Goes to trial in Florida on June 25th, 1979 for the murders of the sorority women. The trial was televised, and I'm not sure how much those trials were televised at that time, but this one was. And he really played up to the media. When on occasion he acted as his attorney. He wore a blazer it was like a Houston Astros ring t-shirt underneath, very casual, almost like fuck everybody, constant smile on his face, still really thinking he could beat the guilty verdict. And this also speaks to his narcissism as well, as he turns down this plea bargain. The plea bargain was he would plead guilty to killing the 2 sorority women and the 3rd woman on that campus, Kimberly Lafauche. She was the one who was in the apartment that evening after he left Chi Omega. And so he would say all this in exchange for 3 25-year sentences. Okay. So initially he saw this deal as a good thing. Initially he's like, you know what? I can avoid the death penalty and I can buy more time. He never thought he would serve these 25-year sentences, but he took it more like, okay, I'm going to take this plea because I can buy some more time. I'll be able to wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate, for witnesses to die or move on. So he had this grandiose delusion that he was just going to outsmart everybody by taking this plea. And sometimes people will often retract their testimony if it's been a few years. They're just like, I don't want to go back to this. I've put it behind me.
You got a plan.
He had this whole method behind what he wanted to do. So he was relying essentially on a potential deterioration of all of this stuff. So he could file then a post-conviction motion to set aside the pleas and secure an acquittal. So this was his big plan. But narcissists are very impulsive. So at the very last moment, that grandiosity really overtook him, that the defense mechanisms kicked in. He became extremely concerned that he would have to actually stand up and admit in front of the whole world that he was guilty. It was really about him not wanting to admit that the court was right and he was wrong. So he ends up rejecting the plea deal. Mike Minerva, he was a public defender at the time. He quoted him to say, Mike quoted it, made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty. He just couldn't do it. So he went on to prove his innocence, which we know how that turned out. In the second episode, when we were talking about Lisa Levy, which was one of the Chi Omega victims who died, they brought in a forensic odontologist and he matched the castings of Bundy's teeth to the bite wounds on her buttocks. Wow. And obviously the casting matched the bite.
Yeah.
And so that was really the smoking gun. So the jury deliberated for less than 7 hours, which is really, I mean, a lot of times juries will sit on these cases for 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah,
if not longer. So less than 7 hours, and they convicted him on July 24th, 1979 of Bowman and Levy murders, which were the two women, 3 accounts of attempt and 2 accounts of burglary. And he received 2 by means of the electric chair. So this is what he received for rejecting the plea.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you believe that the 7-hour deliberation, the speed that happened, do you think it's because they had an overwhelming evidence load, or just the total depravity of the crimes that the jury was emotional about that? Or
I would imagine it's a little bit of both. I think that this guy had been going for 5 years. I think they were finally glad that they caught him. I think that they were able to present a lot of evidence, and I'll get to this towards the end, but the amount of people who surrounded the prison when he was executed, I don't think our country's ever seen anything like that.
Right.
So I think they just wanted him gone. Even the judge, there was a lot of emotional reactivity
in the court.
And I think that definitely played a part in the decision. That's my opinion. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine.
No, for sure. I'm definitely asking you for your.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine that, I also know from testifying in court myself that a lot of times, they'll choose certain times of years, like the summer where teachers are off because they tend to be more of a, they're the ones who get screwed a lot. So depending on the case, they're going to want teachers on the jury. So I think they're going to pick people who are really going to have an aversive response. I don't know, unless you have another psychopath on trial, I don't know how you could root for this guy.
And if Bundy is heading up his own voir dire, jury selection is going to be, I don't know how well he's going to do that, right? It would be for his lawyer to fight to have a fair jury, and I'm guessing he didn't do that very well.
Yeah, so, and he didn't, he didn't want any attorneys working for him.
Right.
So yeah, it was all, God only knows, he thought he knew everything, and he thought he could charm the pants off of everybody because he had done that for so long. There were so many grandiose delusions going on, and he was in denial too. He still at this point, and I'll get to this in the interviews, at this point has not admitted to anything, but he has alluded to potentially knowing the killer. There's some weird stuff that happens in the interview. So he is still really convinced that he is innocent. And even his mother, till the very end, defended him on the stand. Anyway, so 6 months later, a second trial takes place in Orlando. And this is specifically for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach, who was the 12-year-old girl and allegedly his last victim. He was found guilty again after less than 8 hours of deliberation. Very quick decision. And this is interesting because we don't use this a lot in court anymore, but the decision was primarily based on an eyewitness testimony of an individual who actually saw him speaking with Leach and leading her to his stolen van. I believe eyewitness testimony is still at times used in court, but I know that there's been a lot of studies and research since this case that proves it's not really an exact science. So I wonder if this was happening today, if it would have been the same.
They still respected that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think even if the jury just hears it, that's, they're not going to sit there and say, oh, is this an empirically valid science? I think they were just like, wow, okay, someone actually saw this happen.
They're going to believe it.
They're going to believe it. So that happens. And so on February 10th, 1980, he's sentenced for a third time to death by electrocution. So now he has 3 of these. Yeah. So he allegedly stood up during the sentencing announcement for the Leach trial screaming, tell the jury they were wrong. So he really starts to now he starts losing his shit. Mm-hmm. So this is now the 3rd death sentence, and it would be the one that would carry out nearly 9 years later. So the 3 death sentences definitely pushed him ahead of in the front of the line, because, people can be on death row for a really long time.
I would imagine that's the public opinion piece of it too.
I think so too.
The horror, it really pushes them to speed that.
And so many families who didn't have answers. I mean, this guy he was a monster. So sort of random side note, during all of this, he was in a relationship with a woman by the name of Carol Ann Boone. He had been dating her through Chi Omega and all that stuff. So there's this obscure law in the state of Florida. I don't know if it still exists, but it did at the time, that because she was a witness and in the courtroom when he was sentenced, mm-hmm. they allowed him to be legally married simply by making a marriage declaration in front of the judge.
Oh my gosh.
So now he marries her.
I wonder if that happened before or after the death sentence was levied. Like,
I believe
at what point do you stop down?
I believe it was after. She ends up testifying as a character witness in his trial, so she's in the court. So, and then in October 1982, Boone gave birth to a daughter and named Bundy as the father. So somewhere out there, he has a daughter. Be kind of interesting to look at. So that's just kind of some fun facts on the side. So yeah, so the trials end and he gets, rather than just taking a plea deal, this guy ends up with 3 death sentences and scheduled for the electric chair that they would call Old Sparky. I guess it was a chair used quite a bit. And he was one of the last ones to be executed in it, I believe. You can go online and look at pictures of it. It is just really ominous. One, I guess, had been around for a long time and even had a name and the whole thing. And it's just, they have pictures of it and it's just really creepy.
Yeah, that's pretty sick.
Yeah, it's really sick. So that sort of takes us to the end of the trial piece. I mean, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, I think the only thing that I will just elaborate on a little bit is, he was quite a performer in court. He smiled a lot and he was very coy, and he really just wanted, it was almost like he was on stage and really wanted to win the jury over like he had done with these women. And it just didn't work this time. But you can definitely look up, there's a lot of videos, that are his trial, and you can sort of watch his demeanor. It's something I can't really explain through a podcast, but really interesting to sort of watch his body language and the way he sort of presents and carries himself. So that
he knew he had the world stage, right?
Absolutely. I think so. And it's almost like this was his shining moment. This was his fame.
It sure was. We are going to discuss the interviews, I guess, that Bundy participated in while he was incarcerated.
Yeah. So before we get into the main interview, I want to backtrack a little bit to a man by the name of Stephen Michaud, who's actually an author, and he's done a lot of interviews with serial killers, and he's written about a lot of different serial killers, but he actually interviewed Bundy back after he was first arrested, before his first escape. If people listen to the last episode, we talked about how he escaped a couple different times. These interviews that I watched, he would really display his charm and deflection of responsibility. He'd smile and wink at the female reporters. He was self-assured. He spoke in circles. When he was asked if he was guilty, he would laugh, and then he would say, does that include the time when I stole a comic book when I was 5 years old? And then he'd say, I don't really know what you're talking about. And he would say it in this really playful way.
Well, demeaning and condescending.
Yes. And then he would sort of leave it and he would say, I don't really think any man is innocent, but, based on what you're asking me, no, I've never been physically violent. So, and then he would say, we've all transgressed at times in our lives. So he would just sort of play with it, never give a direct answer. And he was really good at taking the focus off of himself by stating that the investigators were wasting time and being irresponsible because they had not caught the right person. So he'd be like, you guys are sitting here interviewing me, but, I'm really concerned that there's this madman out there and he hasn't been caught, and it's really concerning. So Stephen Michaud interviewed him, and this was way before he could actually speak more honestly about his involvement in the murders. So this is really interesting. He would never refer to himself in first person.
Yeah.
So he would describe things in great detail as if he was talking about someone else. And he never spoke about who this murderer was, but he had no problem discussing how someone else could be such a successful serial killer.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, it was really bizarre. And he would remain really charming and use the narcissism to flatter Michaud, telling him that, Michaud has the amount of intelligence and information and skill to actually be a successful serial killer himself.
Mm-hmm.
So he would just deflect a lot. This is kind of interesting. While he was discussing more, and I think this speaks more to the sickness, when he was discussing more intimate parts of the killings, he would grab the recorder and close his eyes and speak into it. And he was described to go into somewhat of like a dissociative state or trance. And he would develop a welt on the left side of his face. And when he finally came to and he would come out of what he was saying, the welt would disappear.
Like
so
alive or something? I mean, I don't know.
I'm assuming it was from the adrenaline, but I think it just spoke to, he was really aroused.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. He was getting off on it.
Yeah. And so he always spoke about this quote unquote successful serial killer must have been really remarkable, but he never said who he was, never gave him a name. So this is the type of interviews that he would give before he was convicted at the end.
And is this something that you see regularly in psychopaths? Because I'm hearing like the depersonalization thing.
Yes. And I have heard that before, where many of them will speak in first person.
Yeah.
They'll refer to themselves by their name.
Oh, you mean in third person?
And
gotcha.
well, that's what I'm sorry. That they won't use first person. That they'll say, like, if I were talking, I'd say Kathy did this or Kathy did that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Except he never used a name, but he essentially did the same thing.
The killer or whatever.
Yeah. This changed while he was on death row. He agreed to a series of interviews when he would actually discuss what he did to his victims. But before he did that, once he got onto death row, there was a guy by the name of Bob Keppel, who's pretty famous. He was a former detective, and he was the most famous as far as out of all the people who ever interviewed Bundy. And he was the one who also got his last interview. And he was able to get information that nobody up until this point had been able to get.
Right.
But it didn't start by Keppel actually seeking him out. It actually started by Bundy seeking Keppel out in 1984. So about 5 years into his sentence, or 4 years into his sentence, when Keppel, he basically said, I want to help Bob Keppel solve the murder of the Green River Killer. He wanted to find the Green River Killer for Bob Keppel because he thought he could help him do that. Mm-hmm. So he contacts Keppel. He gets permission to do that. And Keppel starts to come in. So Keppel is interviewing him in prison while the Green River Killer is out murdering. Bundy agrees to use his skills, his wisdom to help solve the case. But what Bundy didn't realize at this time is he was giving up a lot of himself by discussing the link between sex and violence, the vivid, lurid sex murder films he found fascinating. So really, he gave up a lot of himself, but didn't really lead Keppel to anything to do with the Green River Killer. He let him tilt down to a lot of
just talking more about himself as usual.
Talked more about himself. So Keppel's like, screw this, I'm out. And so that ends. And about 5 years later, now we're getting very close to his execution. Keppel comes back and says, I don't want to discuss the Green River Killer. I want to talk about you. And Bundy agrees to it. In fact, he agreed that he actually enjoyed talking about his killings at this point, which is very different from when he was with Michaud, because now he's admitting to it and he's saying it's him. And part of this is because he had exhausted all of his plea deals. So there was nothing, I mean, it's not like he was ever going to get out of prison. So he was able to sort of fantasize and relive these experiences out loud. So he agreed to speak very frankly with Keppel, and he confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides. And he also started to admit that he had killed more than 36 that were accounted for. Ironically, he had agreed to meet with Keppel 2 days before his scheduled execution.
Oh, okay.
That's when he said he would start talking. So he starts admitting to a dozen more women, offering leads to a dozen more. You could tell that Bundy, he was exhausted. He was out of it. But Keppel stated that despite having 2 hours left to live, he did not mess up any of his stories. He had probably rehearsed it so much. He didn't mess up any of his stories.
Yeah.
But he also didn't believe everything that Bundy shared. He felt like he would say things like he had incinerated skulls and he had given him maps to places and nothing ever added up. And I think it was another game that he was playing because he didn't really want everyone to figure him out, despite what he led people to believe.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. He's interviewing him and Bundy's like, I know everybody's interested in the why. Let me tell you about, why did I do this? But Keppel's like, I don't really want to know about the why. I want to know detailed information about what you did. So he starts discussing unidentified remains. He starts writing down the names of the people and passing them over to Keppel so it wasn't recorded and the police couldn't find the bodies. So he starts playing all these games. But this is the first time he gives information and a map to Georgiana Hawkins, who was one of his first victims, which was a really big deal. So the investigators followed the map to the skull, but it wasn't there. So he's playing all these games. But he starts to talk about how he knocked her out unconscious with a crowbar, putting her in the passenger side of his car. He would describe in detail their conversations when she came into consciousness, and then he would knock her out again. He was really just reliving this and thoroughly enjoying it.
It's like kind of deathbed admissions too, deathbed confessions kind of.
Yeah.
Although there's a part of me that thinks maybe he was so deluded by then or always that he didn't actually really believe they were going to kill him.
Well, interesting you say that, and I totally agree, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Just like when he escaped from prison, it was just another one of those, like, no one's ever going to catch me if you can. So what he did admit to, and I thought this was really interesting because we don't typically see a lot of anxiety with psychopaths. They tend to be very calm, cool, and collected. But he did say after he strangled and killed Hawkins, he had this surge of panic and horror that rushed through him. So he started throwing articles of clothing out of the car, other evidence out of his car. He's like, I threw out the handcuffs, and then I would get mad at myself when I had to go out and buy another pair a couple of weeks later. He would go back to the scene the next day where the police officers were already all over the place. And so he said, the reason I was nervous was that there was anything left in the parking lot was that I had used the same MO a couple of weeks ago. He had spoken to a girl on campus and used the same crutches and conversation. So he had decided that evening, for whatever reason, he didn't want to kill this girl. So when he killed Hawkins, he was paranoid that they would interview this girl and his identity would be blown. So that was a big, so he starts to open up about a lot of these details, and there's too much to really talk about, but he knew things about Hawkins that only her family would know. So, Keppel was like, he definitely, he was definitely her killer. He confessed that initially he murdered the women to cover up evidence, and then it became an adventure. So initially it was more like he would harass them, he would, assault them, and then he would kill them to cover up the evidence so they wouldn't say anything. And then after a while, it just became this thrill.
Well, that's interesting that there was really an evolution of the motivation for him. Like at first it was more about power and control and toying with them, much like he was toying with the public and these interviewers. And then it moved into the kill actually being something that he included in that enjoyment or whatever. Oh, that's really interesting.
And then he sort of finished it by saying taking a life for him was the ultimate possession. I mean, that's playing God, right? So as well as the physical collection of the remains, which we had talked about in other episodes where he would go back, he would move them, he would put makeup on them, have sex with them. And this was interesting too. He had made implications that he actually began murdering before 1974, but he never directly said it.
Oh, okay.
So we don't really know. I mean, it could have gone back all the way to when we were talking about in the first episode, the little girl, the 8-year-old neighbor that disappeared and they never found. So who knows?
This is what's hard about this, is that it's either that or this is more the toying with reality, in that he wants you to believe he was more prolific than he might have actually been.
Absolutely. And I mean, in following his profile so far, that would totally fit, right? He wanted to go down as this notorious.
He's just going to take credit for everything.
For everything.
Yeah.
And so the very last interview that he has, I think hours before, maybe an hour before his execution, he's crying and he's remorseful. And for whatever reason, Bob Keppel bought it, but I did not buy it.
Okay. He was there, so I imagine he'd spent so many hours with the guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was just, I think it was more of a performance. But what I did research a long time ago was that he was very, very, very resistant and quite fearful and terrified when they were preparing him for the chair. I saw actually a couple documentaries that went all the way to the preparation of it. It was really quite disturbing to watch. As horrific as this monster was, watching someone childlike state.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. And I can understand on many levels why he'd be disturbed. At the heart of it, he's like a little bitty baby. There's another factor in that if he really didn't really believe it was going to happen, then all of a sudden, oh wait, oh crap, this
reality
is going to happen. And it's just scary. I mean, they're last meal, last rites, lay you down, strap you. I mean, you know, well, and put a hood on you. I mean, it's a whole thing.
Well, and I didn't know this, and people out there probably do. I never knew this because I just never really thought about it. But because we don't use the electric chair anymore, but I guess they would, and this must have been so intrusive. You know, they would take cotton balls and shove him in his anus so he didn't soil himself.
Oh my God, there's just so much preparation for death that we never really go through.
And yeah, and just the way they described his resistance and crying and fighting, and he was terrified. And there's just something really so inhumane.
Yeah.
And that's why when we think about stuff like this, it's like, wow, I mean, the worst of the worst.
Yeah,
right?
it's difficult. So, we're not taking away anything from the fact that you could deliberate about whether he deserved that or not. That's up to each individual to decide whether they believe in the death penalty. But either way, no matter who it is in the chair or on the table, it's still very disturbing. Whether you are yay or nay on the issue, it's a disturbing process to be a witness. Yeah, absolutely. This last bit will be a discussion on Bundy's death row experience and his execution, right?
Bundy was moved out of his cell after he was found with hacksaw blades behind like bars of his window. I mean, how did this guy got this stuff?
How does that happen?
I don't know. In an unauthorized mirror, which I'm assuming he was using as a blade.
So I'm making up stories now, but that's like the guards gave him that so he'd kill himself or something. You know, like I'm making up stories.
Yeah.
Why?
It's crazy.
Where? What?
I know. And I know that, you know, when they're on death row, it's a whole other, the way that they're ignored or whatever over there on that section is completely different. But this is just insane. So listen to this. He's given a disciplinary infraction because he has unauthorized correspondence with John Hinckley Jr. So he's reaching out to Kennedy's alleged assassin, like close. You know, I mean, he's all over the place. He needed a good friend. So here we get back to the point where when you were saying he didn't think he was going to die or he could get out of it again. So he was so manipulative that he actually knew Bob Keppel could stay his execution. He could be the one that could say, we're going to put a pause on this. So he puts a request in for another 60 to 90 days so he can provide all of the details and that all of the people and the victims' families would have the full story. I mean, how nice of him, right? Right. He was intelligent. He knew how to play this legal system. So he waited until the 11th hour to actually talk. So he didn't give any of this information, like I was saying, up until about an hour or two before his execution. Okay. So another game. And then 10 years prior, he actually tried getting out of the Chi Omega murders by getting a book deal, which he would describe as innocence. I mean, this guy, he has tried everything to get out of and so many of the different
manipulations throughout his life work. I mean,
exactly.
I don't blame him for continuing to try and continuing to do all of these different manipulations because they work.
They've worked.
So why not keep trying it?
Well, and then to add insult to injury, by the time he got to the Kimberly Leach trial, he actually allowed attorneys to represent him because, you know, he kind of blew up his own.
He finally realized.
Yeah. So he had this young Florida attorney and it was allegedly his last love interest. Take a narcissist to fall in love with their attorney and sort of control that.
It's himself, right? Like, He wanted,
Yes.
he was being his own attorney. He wants to be in control of everything. He probably wanted, he wanted to be an attorney. And so he's falling in love with the mirror again. Oh my God.
Yep. Oh my God. So her name's Diana Weiner. She begins to lobby to give him more time so he could offer more information. So, you know, he had her right where he needed to be. Florida governor, as well as all the families of the victims, are like, no.
Yeah.
So then the day of his actual execution, he tries to delay it again by debating the death warrant and extending the sentence. And they're like, no, the death warrant's valid. You're still burning. Since he had already done this, Florida authorities would no longer allow this because he had already done this one time before. And they're like, okay, guy, you have just run out of everything. Like, you're done.
Yeah.
I think one of the parts that was hard for his wife, I mean, I'm sure there were many, but up until this point, she was a character witness in his trial and really stood by him and believed him. But he started admitting to everything in the end. She felt so betrayed and probably, I cannot imagine what she went through mentally and emotionally, that she would not even speak to him on the day of his execution. And she and their daughter moved, I think, to Washington or something. So on the eve of Bundy's execution, he did threaten suicide. You know, because God forbid, he didn't want the state to have the satisfaction of taking his life and watching him die. Inevitably, Bundy died in the Rayford electric chair, which had been nicknamed Old Sparky. He died at 7:16 a.m. on January 24th, 1989. He was 42 years old. And hundreds of people stood outside of this prison. They danced, they sang, they saw fireworks, and they actually continued to cheer loudly as the white hearse passed by. People celebrated this.
Yeah, they sure did. And I understand that. He created a lot of fear and a lot of hatred. And I mean, not only his actions, but also his behavior created that. And that's typical of this kind of person, obviously. Well, wow, this has been so interesting. We did a 3-part series on Ted Bundy, our very first series.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was very intelligent in some ways and a complete moron.
Right. Well, ways. Just like self-saboteur, right? Just his own defenses and behavior and flaws and wounds and all the stuff we know about in psychology just would take whatever goal he had, it would blow up.
I mean, it would have been interesting to see if he would have either allowed someone to represent him or if he would have taken the plea deal, if anything would have changed. But he may still have gotten the death penalty with Kimberly Leach, but he may still have been on
it. It might have been more drug out.
But there's so much research out on this guy. If people want to know more, there's so many books. I recommended in the first episode, Anne Rule, The Stranger Beside Me. I could do an entire series just on her story with him. I mean, there's just so much on this guy. And this was really a crash course, Cliff's Notes version of Ted Bundy because there's so much information.
Yeah, I mean, this we wanted to just give the overarching story and details of it, and then if at some point in the future, you know, you get sparked by something that you want to, do a follow-up to this, or we'll do another episode on that, and that'd be great. Or if there's anybody out there that wants to, send us an email and let us know if there's something in particular we didn't cover, or something that we talked about, or a question that you had that I didn't ask, and so that we could keep that conversation going if you're interested in this particular topic. Other than that, I thank you very, very much, Dr. Kathy Barrett, for
welcome.
A really overarching, detailed story of Ted Bundy. And that's it for this series. And listen to us next week. We'll be back. We have new episodes every Wednesday.